this session, the first session, Evolutionary Perspectives on Democracy from the Local to the Global Dimension. It is my pleasure to announce, well, no, before having the pleasure to announce, I give the rule for this thing. The talks are 15 minutes. I have my timer here, and the presenters will see the timing. I will tell them when they have 5 minutes left, and then I will stop them at when 15 minutes are gone. I don't know if there is time for questions or not. They should be within the 15 minutes. So if they want the questions, they have to end earlier, right? Okay. So we don't care about the timing? No, come on. The first speaker is Nick Duffel, and he's a psychotherapist and psychohistorian from London. The title is The Identity Block: Why Initiatives Towards Supranational Democracy and Governance Must Incorporate a Depth Psychological Perspective if they are to succeed. The floor is yours.
Right. Okay, thank you for coming. Thank you, Susanna, very much for inviting me, making this happen. I guess many of you are wondering, what on earth is a psychotherapist doing here? And speaking to this conference, and I don't blame you, and I've been wondering, why should a psychotherapist start this conference? My fantasy is that maybe to get it over and done with when people are arriving. And how come you've got now a psychotherapist when you're expecting a bishop? These are some tricky questions we won't be answering. Except for, I think there's some wisdom in Susanna's idea to have me start, because what actually drives politics and economics? Is it rationality? I'm very sorry. If only it was so. No, pure rationality is not what drives it. I mean, it's pure emotion, drives campaigns and elections, stock markets, and consumerism, and even motivates the values of the apparently rational political scientist and the apparently balanced news anchor. And the understanding of how emotion, and particularly unconscious feelings, drives behavior is the business of us shrinks. So I like to claim my place right at the beginning of this important dialogue we're having here. And besides, it's also what we in England call a health and safety issue, because you cannot understand the madness of the phenomena of Trump and Brexit without understanding very basic psychological things, how emotions drive politics, particularly the politics of blame and hatred, and how states of consciousness can be manipulated and broadcast by those who ought to know better, and how the business of usual attitude really makes sure that many of our young people remain politically or electorally apathetic. And these are big problems. So, you know, it's particularly important at this time when we've never been so polarized as, you know, in my lifetime, I can't remember us being so polarized. And when those who are losing out under globalization and who may have no foreseeable future, such as the traditional industrial working classes of the Western world, start to use their voting power as a protest. But from a wider perspective, as a psychotherapist, it's quite easy to see how a whole bunch of humanity is doing a regression before having to make a big transformative shift. See, here we go, here they're coming. And I see this regularly in my clinical practice, that human beings often regress before making a big, important change, and very often in a masochistic way. So I think we are regressing now because we have to take an enormous step, which is to self-organize cooperatively as one world in alignment with these irreversible facts Suzanne was talking about, that information, communications, finances, the labor movement, and all the most urgent problems are totally global. While our mindset stays stuck in modernist nation-state thinking, panicking about the notions of national sovereignty, which is actually disappearing. And my colleague John Bunsell over here will talk a lot more about this, but I'm going to disappoint you again right from the beginning by saying I think this has very little to do with reforming or creating new overarching institutions. I think that's just tinkering with the model. But I think the job is radically changing our thinking patterns and our identities. This is more of a challenge, but it's more effective. So we need some relevant psychology if we're going to take a step forwards towards supranational self-organization. And in fact, as the evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson said, today's humans are subject to more stimulation than our nervous systems were originally equipped for. He says, we're beset with godlike technology while we still got Stone Age emotions, and we're still governed by medieval belief systems. So collectively, human beings are actually under-equipped and overwhelmed by increasing complexity, and not surprisingly paralyzed to move forward. Hence, we regress into polarization, right-wing chauvinism, or fragmented left-wing oppositionalism. And I'll say a bit more about that later. So, and next, as a psychotherapist, I'm dealing with the business of identity. And here we have huge problems because everyone in the game is blocked, I believe, at the level, almost everyone, at the level of identity. And identity is the greatest driver in our political process and has hardly been reckoned with so far. Because you've got a problem in the human context. The human cortex cannot stop saying, who am I? It's impossible to switch it off. So you look in the mirror and you say, every time you get an answer, oh, I'm too fat, I'm too short, I'm too bald, or maybe not so bad for your age today, It's always doing this stuff. So, and one of the most fundamental things is, of identity is where do I belong? Who do I belong with? And it's crucial. And it never stops. So at the moment, my cortex is firing. I'm an Englishman. I'm having fun in exotic Italy. I've got the bishop listening to my talk. This is all affecting my identity. But other things are, they're assaulting us all the time. For example, we've got a problem in our nations where we're divided in terms of how people see the world through different levels of consciousness. And different levels of consciousness, as Claire Graves showed very clearly, does not affect intelligence levels. It's not about intelligence. But it does affect values, it does affect mindsets, and it does affect conclusions drawn from perceptions and therefore perception. For a large extent, our populations are still in a very traditional mindset, and they're being fed on a diet of consumerism rather than by the church these days. And those whose traditional work is actually about to run out. What are we going to do with these people? What's going to happen? It's a huge ID crisis. And politicians are always behind the curve. That's a definition of being a politician, in fact. And they are largely modernist. They're concerned with growth and competition and exploitation. And actually, they can't cope at the moment. They're just treading water. And our academics are largely postmodernist, busy deconstructing power relations and repeating calls for social justice and diversity while ignoring just how to make such things actually happen. Those who hold a really genuine global perspective are still a very small minority. And it goes further. One of the reasons I decided to get out of, the psychotherapy, it's a very hallowed world. It's all inside the consulting room. It's all inside your head. Actually, no. People are living in the context, and mental health is declining in very serious ways. So I decided I had to get outside and into the messy world of politics to bring in some of the psychological knowledge, particularly the knowledge of how dissociation works. Dissociation. So my speciality in the psychotherapy world was that I had pioneered a study of the effects of British elite boarding schools. And I saw how people who had their attachments, which is the bond between children, parents and family, deliberately broken in order to make them good servants of the British Empire, so you could be out on the northwest frontier and still feel superior. And it's still going on in British schools today. So, I realized that in a way that was the 19th century was running on this, really, and how when you have children who are not allowed to be sad about being on their own, have to cut off all their feelings, they lack intimacy as adults and empathy skills, and when they become politicians, because there's a big career path in Britain for that, they have grown up saying, you're not allowed to be vulnerable, so how can they possibly understand the socially vulnerable? So I've written a couple of books about this. This one was my last one, which was inspired by Cameron's government. And one of the things that happened with this is that I got an article in the Guardian in 2014 that got retweeted just after Brexit on the Guardian Facebook page, and I had 220,000 shares of this thing. I just couldn't understand it. I didn't get the sales, unfortunately, but you could make up for that. But I realized people wanted an explanation why we were having such disastrous leadership. And it has to do with widespread and the normalized use of dissociation. Because one of the things I was saying is actually the whole modernist project rests on dissociation. Because modernism is all about freedom, and it's all about exploitation, and it's all about technology, and if I can do that to the planet without any conscience, then I can go ahead, and it's still going on. Yeah. So we realize that actually leaders brought up in that tradition are very, very inflexible and aren't really good for the future. So, for example, in Britain, we had a man called John Major who hadn't been to that schooling, and he liked Europe, and he knew how to ask for help. But Tony Blair, or Boris, or Cameron, or Theresa May, they don't know how to make friends and make relationships and ask for help and say, we're all in this together. And I sort of said, how could people who hadn't had enough belonging really belong to a cooperative union? So dissociation becomes really the driver of modernism, and it's completely outdated in terms of the needs for empathic communalism that we've got in terms of the world problem. Now, here's the bad news. You've got postmodernism coming on top of that, which is simply a reaction to it. And what I saw as I kept on looking at what's going on in politics is that postmodernism comes in the 60s and says, how unfair that the haves have rationalized a world that entirely dominate the have-nots, and that race, class, and gender is a stitch-up. And it's right, but the response ends up, because it's built over modernism, just trying to get everybody in the big tent, as we call, and makes a mistake of making equality and sameness the same thing, which it isn't. So, it is a big problem in gender studies. Yeah, equal pay would be nice, but I would much rather have more feminine values in the way we do things. Not more women. We've had Thatcher and Theresa May in our country. So I'm sorry to say that postmodernism is now run out of steam, and it's reached its sell-by date, because it's based on the same kind of dissociation. Now, this one goes like this. We are the good guys. And you bad corporations, politicians, polluters are the bad guys. Now, I have to tell you, you may think it's true, but psychologically it's very uncreative, because you get very stuck and polarized. Yeah? And I think the whole social justice movement is plagued by this. The fact is, we're all in the same boat. But as long as you stay in this unconscious identification, I'm the good child and the bad parents are out there and they ought to fix things. And I tell you, it's not going to happen. It's very, very uncreative, and it's the same dissociation as modernism. So, and I get stuck when I'm in that mode in my rebel. And the rebel always needs something to rebel against. Yeah? And my thinking is like, stays very adolescent. So, we have got to do some psychological work to get out of that, because globalization is a new impersonal and transnational form of colonialism, and actually it's not going to end, unfortunately, but we have to make it work. So and those of us on the left are very good at sort of pressing the self-destructive button. So we have to come out of denial about this issue, that everyone is in the same boat. And that's where, when I met John Bunzel and cooperated with him on this work of Simple, and he'll tell you more about it later, I realized this is the only initiative I've seen so far which says, it's psychologically literate, let's break out of this identity block and realize that politicians cannot do what we want them to do, cannot just be the good parents that are going to fix anything. We've got to train them, and we've got to do this in a bottom-up way. And we, especially as academics, we've just got to get out of this, we are the ones who know, and they are the ones who don't. We are the good, we're bad. It's a very big trap for inactivity, because actually now we have to act, and the first thing we have to do is to really think globally, and that means we're all in it together. Thank you very much.
Wow, bravo. Yes, you have to do the same, obviously. But first, we have the bishop who came to say hello to us.
Sono lieto di dare il benvenuto in questa realtà, in questa struttura antica e sempre aperto al dialogo con la cultura. E soprattutto in questo momento, dalla parte di relazione che ho sentito che è molto importante e che secondo me abbiamo già avuto alcune indicazioni, tra l'altro, in ciò che Papa Francesco ha scritto nella Laudato Si, cioè nel rapporto tra la persona e la natura. Perché? Perché la persona, e questo dovrebbe essere il vero modo anche di approccio anche alla stessa cultura scientifica, di tenere presente che si tratta di esercitare quella signoria dello scienziato e quindi della persona sulla natura. E quindi se questo vale per la natura, a fortiori e a maggior ragione vale per le persone. Oggi c'è la tendenza, in molte situazioni, ad espropriare la persona di questa dignità perché una cultura o globalizzata o che ha altri metri, punti di riferimento, valutazioni etiche, crede di potersi sostituire a questo. L'ultimo esempio è quello che si sta verificando in Inghilterra per questa bambina per la quale è stata chiesta solo la disponibilità di poterla curare in un modo diverso, ma non è ancora concesso. Perché? E c'è una considerazione poi importante da questo punto di vista. Contrariamente a quanto si diceva, una volta tolta la ventilazione forzata, sta continuando a vivere. Però non viene ancora concesso la possibilità di andare altrove. E allora questa democrazia che cos'è? È un'ipocrita definizione per dire che il bene comune, ma se il bene comune è anche la singola persona, deve essere rispettata. Diversamente non è assolutamente democrazia. È un'altra forma di ideologia del potere. E se questo episodio che si sta verificando in questi giorni tra l'Inghilterra e Roma si verifica anche per le considerazioni sulla natura, tutto il grande discorso che stiamo vivendo qui a proposito di TAP e non TAP, voglio essere molto esplicito, perché già mi sono pronunciato quando sono arrivato qui. Non si tratta di dire sì o no oggi, si tratta di capire perché a suo tempo furono fatti determinati accordi. E questo lo dovrebbero spiegare i politici oggi, non continuando a cavalcare posizioni di comodo nel momento opportuno. Noi possiamo fare tutte le belle conferenze che vogliamo, se poi ciascuno di noi non si assume le responsabilità anche di dire ho sbagliato, ho frainteso, oppure è bene che sia così. Allora è vero che va avanti il dialogo culturale anche su posizioni diverse, ma assumendo ciascuno la propria responsabilità di quello che dice e di quello che sceglie. Vi ringrazio perché questa vostra presenza qui dà lustro alla diocesi. Io mi sento molto onorato di potervi parlare, mi dispiace di non poter comunicare in inglese, ma solo in francese perché quella è stata la mia cultura.
O in latino. O in latino.
Latino un po', perché quando ero giovane le lezioni erano ancora in latino,
Quindi.
lezioni di metafisica o altro. Bene, buon lavoro e grazie e benvenuti a Lecce. Benvenuti.
Grazie mille. Grazie mille. E non dimentichiamo la conversione ecologica che chiede Francesco. E vuol dire convertirsi ad una scienza, perché la scienza è l'ecologia.
Allora, la mia esperienza più bella a questo proposito è di avere affidato a dei ragazzi studenti delle scuole medie di secondo grado articoli di commento sulla Laudato Si, che è diventato il programma di tutto un anno come programma di religione, proposto dal docente perché i ragazzi imparino il rispetto della natura.
Perché purtroppo nella scuola non c'è.
Allora, ve ne farò dono tra poco di un volume, uno solo.
D'accordo, grazie mille. And so now it's time for Myra Jackson, United Nations Permanent Representative and Focal Point on Climate Change, Diplomat of the Biosphere, Washington, D.C., USA, who will tell us about Earth Renaissance, perturbations of a changing planet. The floor is yours. No, not yet. Can I go? Go.
Yes. Well, hello, everyone. I tell you, I'm looking out at you, and you look gorgeous to me. I'm happy to be in the room. Susanna and I met over a year and a half ago at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and I'm happy that this moment has come. You were dreaming of it then, and here we are. And there's something about each time I come to speak on this topic that I am with a bishop or cardinal or even the Pope. Last year I was with the Pope at the Vatican. We went through the encyclical with other cardinals, and there seems to be a theme going on. But I have spent a lot of time in Italy. I love being here. I've lived here for a year or more of my time, and happy to be here in Lecce, which I have not been before. So thank you. Let me get on with this topic. And I'm going to begin here with something familiar to you all. These slides are going to be a little bit out of format because I converted over to Keynote, so forgive that. And that is with the European Renaissance. And why do I want to evoke that? Well, I hope to make that clear as we go on, because I feel as though there's something happening for all of us, and it's happening right in our bones, right in our blood, right in our DNA. And it is similar to the Renaissance period that started out so early on here, when that big change of mind was happening. No one called it the Renaissance. It was happening in us. We were bumping up against each other, so to speak, and sharing ideas that were coming out of books that had made their way out, but mostly had been destroyed in Alexandria and other places. And it was stimulating new thought. And that launched what we call today that Renaissance. And with that is a lot came out of that period. However, it was a continuation of that larger pattern of conqueror, conquest, and appropriation. And though we were dealing with those new themes of humanism and that whole idea of man being the measure of all things, we have come to the end of the usefulness of that, it seems. It seems now we have to reach for something else in our own DNA that connects us to something larger, that will help us to think about our challenges as a global society, living on a global planet with a new view. You know, and Einstein speaks of this view as displacement theory. He says you're never going to solve the problems that you have with the same level of thinking, correct? And so I just want to point this out because I was 10 years old when this moment happened where we had a chance to see the Earth for the first time from space, to see what it looked like, what we were living on, what home was. And that glimpse of a shared home to me is what, of course, gave birth to many words like ecology and so on. But this is our shared space. And the biosphere, of which I am the diplomat of from Stockholm Resilience Center, it forces me to think about the biosphere, that liminal space in which our lives happen, the soil, the earth, the air. And we got a chance to look at that, to glimpse that. And I still think humanity is processing that moment, even today. It's moving us and rocking us. Those are the perturbations of the planet speaking to us. I feel its voice. I feel very much connected to it as Great Mother. And so much happened around that time. A few years earlier in the United States, a woman named Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring. And a whole new generation of people at the 50th anniversary are rereading her book and understanding more and more how was it that we could be walking on the planet and not have a sense of belonging to the earth of which we completely depend upon. How is that? And we've had this thing called Earth Day happening. It's a global phenomenon, but still we're coming against the 50-year anniversary in 2020. And have we made progress in understanding what it means to be in relationship to the earth? That's the question. So let me share my frustration when I was 10 years old looking at the earth going, oh my God. I was being fed stories through the newsreel, through the media, through television, and it was all about the men who landed on the moon. But I wanted to see the earth. So here goes the narrative. Man's great conquering, this great victory. And it gets even more profane. Look at this ad where man is just propped up and he's got his Heineken or whatever it is. Forget the earth. Here's what it's about. Well, in my view, I'll just land right into my thesis here, is I do believe in that moment that an earth renaissance began. It wasn't one about books destroyed in the libraries of antiquity. No, it's something more intimate, more primal than that. It's that which we come from. You know, our bodies are in the immediate environment in which we live in, and it's a microcosm of the Earth's body. When we're walking on the Earth, we're walking through our other body, our larger body. And if there's any humanity to blossom within us, it's because we recognize our relationship to the Earth. Now, this is I certainly share a picture of many because I have traveled throughout Europe and the world in search of the Black Madonnas. So this is the one from Montserrat, yes, Barcelona. And I feel, you know, that what we're doing is we're in the midst of a shift from the power over nature to power with nature. And from a humanity that feels separate from nature to our own restoration of those sacred bonds with nature in a way that activates our governing felt sense about the interactions we have in the social dimension. And that goes to what really I feel the supranational democracy questions are loaded with. And Susanna laid them out. So what are the signs of this Earth Renaissance? Well, I feel it has a lot to do with this agitation, this perturbations that are happening from the planet, where we feel we know our institutions are lacking and they're passing by. We're feeling the loss of the species that are going into the mass extinction. We feel something's terribly wrong. And if we're at all sensitive and we're all connected with our humanity, then it's calling us into creativity. And so these movements are underway on the planet, and there's a drive to protect the Earth. After all, you know, Pope Francis has written this encyclical, and he started other religious organizations and spiritual organizations to think, what is our doctrinal stance on nature? Then there's the convergence of movements and the migration of people. I will tell you, so far on the planet, every time we have seen massive displacements of peoples, we have seen significant change. Genghis Khan, right? Massive movement. And the migration underway it's also another part of the perturbations. But remember, we're a part of nature. And nature is being displaced by land loss and climate change and all other modalities. Many reasons for the displacement of people as well. So what am I also seeing in that is something I'm very excited about and I want to focus in on, because there are 100 things I could focus on, but I want to bring something home to you. And that is that rights of nature is on the rise. And it's based on understanding that not only are we looking at human as the measurement of all things, but the Earth might be a measurement we want to consider if we want to continue. Many local climate scientists now are focused on the social dimension and moving away from the whole study, really, of climate change, because that's known to them. They're saying, how are we going to make the change? So they're focused on the social dimension. They're focusing on existing risk that will cause the greatest action, and that's impact on 10% of the human population. They're looking at other emerging risks around artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and biotechnology, and also the natural risks, supervolcanoes, asteroids, pandemics. And underlying that, they're aware that extreme poverty is not only a threat, but it's an ongoing catastrophe, and that population growth of 11.2 billion that we're looking at 2100 is also an underlying concern. I'm going to skip through these. But what I want to also hone in on is that wherever we see ecocide, and this is terminology coming out of the UK from Polly Higgins, who's done incredible work to try to look at the idea of ecocide, some would call biocide. And E.O. Wilson was mentioned earlier. E.O. Wilson has coined biophilia, the other end, our love of nature. Wherever we see ecocide, we see increased violence against women and children animals slaughtered and captured, human trafficking, genocide, corruption. There are co-incidences happening here that are directly related to those violations of nature that impact human rights. So this is not a discussion about earth over human. This is putting us in place. We are a part of nature. Now, since 2008, when the Republic of Ecuador included in their constitution rights of nature, a grassroots movement has begun around the world to do the same. Not only did Ecuador include rights of nature, it also included food sovereignty and gender rights. The New Zealand River was granted the same legal rights as a human being in March of 2017. They had been negotiating that for 140 years. But remember, these are our indigenous peoples on the planet who've never lost in their cosmology or worldview the idea of being connected to the earth. It's still in their DNA, and thank goodness we still have them on the planet as a reference point. They know the mother tongue. They know how to read that library. And so this, since the sighting of Earthrise, we're seeing now a movement toward adopting into law a view, our values, Claire Graves, an understanding of values translating into the polity, into the jurisprudence, to protect nature, because we know we're bound up and linked with it. But look at what's gone before, you know? What's gone before is our idea that we can own people as property, going to the wayside, animal rights, children, suffragist movement, and now Earth law. Crowning, rising to the top. How is it rising? The United Nations, very quietly, adopted a resolution to recognize not only the principles of harmony with nature, but a declaration of International Mother Earth Day. And I just left on Monday from our 8th dialogue on harmony with nature. It's embedded in the Sustainable Development Goal 12. And I'm very delighted that through the growing support, even now from the EU Parliament now, we had several in our meeting on Monday, that the EU is beginning to move in this direction, and this is good news. I want you all staying on top of that, please. So there's a move to recognize the Lake Zurich, also a lake in Hungary, and in Assisi already. I spoke with the mayor last year when I spoke there, and they're moving to establish rights of nature in Umbria. And if you look at these pinpoints, you'll see many other places in the world. I can't go into it all, but what I want you to know, this is not being led by the United Nations. People are moving on rights of nature. Why do you think so? Because they're looking at the world they want resilience in their communities, they want real connection, no more fake belonging, as I call it. Real connection. And so I think that what I would want to say at this point, as I see the moments heading down the path, is that there's a lot of money going into organizations that are looking at these views. We've got to learn how to use that for good deliberative shared action. The opportunities to restore the sacred bonds with nature are there, but I want to impress upon all of you that our neurobiology is set up to go towards what we can envision together in our future. A shared future is what we need to focus on, not what we don't want. We need to really focus on what we do want. That's where we can really gain the momentum and the energy. And so let's become more literate and interested in reading Earth's libraries. Let's do that. And go along with this idea of evolutionary biologists who say to us, this is not competition now, folks. At this level of complexity, it's about greater cooperation and collaboration that will help us evolve our humanity. So I thank you for the supranational politics and for keeping the dialogue going. Thank you all.
thank you for keeping the time perfectly.
Thank you.
So we ranged from our inner self to the biosphere.
That's
and
right.
So it's really interesting. And I would like to say many things, but I cannot because I am the chair. But let me say just that in the Italian Constitution, in Article 9, there is the landscape and there is the cultural heritage. There is no nature. The landscape is nature modified by humans. So in our national values, nature doesn't exist, okay? And it should be introduced. Okay, so thank you very much. And now I call Sarah Hutzinger, Professor of Anthropology Department, Colorado College, USA, Mobilizing for Resiliency in the Face of Climate Change, the Global in Local Dialogue.
This is the hot seat here.
Yes.
Good morning. So grateful to be here, and grateful to Susanna and everyone else for making this possible. I know how much work has gone into this, and just delighted to be part of it.
You don't need that?
I don't. Nope.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's leave that up. My work on climate change, which is a relatively new turn in my own focus. I come out of a background of working on violence, war, and trauma within anthropology. My work right now that I want to tell you about takes an educational and an ethnographic approach. And I need to take you to a very specific place because my involvement with this place is what has led to this turn in my own focus. And the purpose of taking you to one place is not because this particular place is any more important than any other place, but it's one tile in a mosaic of creating, I think, connections, creating democracy based in community, in localities, in relationships of people, in bodies, in environments where we eat and sleep and make love and laugh together. And the idea that supranational democracy comes from below, and also creating connections across transnational connections to train states, to train nation states to be able to respond to the will of communities. So picture yourself driving to a town that is going to dead end into staggering, rugged mountains. There are 14,000 foot peaks right behind the town of Crestone, Colorado, in the western United States, my home state. And the range behind us is the Sangre de Cristo range. The Spanish called it the blood of Christ because of the ways that these mountains would turn red at sunset. But Native Americans for millennia before this, reportedly in many languages, called the San Luis Valley, a high mountain valley, the Bloodless Valley, because this was a place that was not the territory of any tribe. It was neutral territory. It was a place for vision questing, for hunting and gathering during famines, and a place that was held as sacred. Some people called it the center of Turtle Island or all of North America. And more recently, this Bloodless Valley turned Blood of Christ has become a center, an international mecca of over 25 different international religious groups. And there is a long story for another day of prophecy and visions and how all of these different communities came to be grounded in the area around Crestone, Colorado. But it involves Hannah Strong and Maurice Strong of United Nations climate fame, giving grants to communities. And now there are over 10 different lineages of Buddhism, many Tibetan, but also Zen and Bhutanese. There's Zoroastrians, there's Shinto-based Shumei community, 3 different Hindu-based communities, Carmelites. I was glad to have the bishop here, since in some ways what we're talking about that is distinctive about this particular place is the spiritual aspect of a community response to the moment that we find ourselves, the challenge that we find ourselves at environmentally right now. I bring students there. I've been bringing them there for over 20 years, college students, and we do community-based learning, what I call interactional ethnography. And so the product, maybe there's a book or an article out there in the future, but the real product is the immediate interaction with the community, that the students come in as witnesses. The occasion of their visits creates a moment where the community can circulate its own knowledge about itself. And this place, the Tibetan Rinpoches and Lamas have talked about it as being uniquely conducive to seeking enlightenment and meditation, because they say something about the geophysics of the way that winds pass, irradiated by sunlight at high altitude, across the second biggest aquifer below ground in North America, hit those Sangre de Cristo mountains, and there's an uplifting. In any case, because of all these religious communities and because of the uniqueness of this place, people have also talked about it as a cradle for the future, or a place where a new civilization of human beings can evolve and emerge, a place that can be a refuge for world truths. And so this is how Crestone is relevant to our conversation, just as many other places would be. But the idea that we have to ground our notions of democracy in community processes. But anthropologists are especially interested in spiritual practices, including religions, but not exclusive to that, in evolutionary terms. Why can spirituality have adaptive power? Well, if we in the climate change community bemoan, we know what we should do technologically, we know what we should do in terms of policy and politics and economics, but we don't seem to have the will to do it, we can observe that it is within community, and especially spiritual communities, that people are enjoined to higher levels of collaboration, of discipline, of sacrifice. And the idea is of mutual trust, of commitment. And the idea is that places like Crestone might afford refuges for these kinds of experiments, innovation, and emergence. Well, in just the last 18 months in Crestone, things have heated up in response to climate change, so to speak. I, along with Myra Jackson and others involved in this area, have accompanied a series of retreats convened specifically along these lines to create a community response to climate change. The first one was a spiritual ecology retreat. Myra organized a retreat called the Convergence of the Interspirituality Network. But in particular, there was a 3-day retreat with over 100 community members called the Resiliency Search Conference, out of which emerged 8 task teams. And these, most of them were quite concrete about securing water rights, energy work toward carbon neutrality, housing, water, food security, creating community development corporation, community center, and then the paradigm shift to help fan the community fires toward this. And these initiatives incorporate aspects of social, emotional, and spiritual wellness and what my hero, Donna Haraway, calls responsibility, the ability to respond. And so the educator in me is looking for ways that we equip ourselves, communities, but especially young people, especially the generations of youth that are gifted with this opportunity, to be able to find places of what I call abiding, in between utter despair and, oh, game over, it's all over, which it's not. There are many, many generations to come, even in this damaged planet that we find ourselves, and facile, deus ex machina, we'll figure this out with technological waves of the wand. And finding visions for sustainable or at least survivable futures through teaching this abiding. And so first we do need to attend to people's emotional, spiritual, and community relationships as the first building block of responsibility and supernatural democracy. National, not natural. Maybe it is supranational, natural too. Anyway, a place like Crestone can really be a model for collective responsiveness to climate change for some of the reasons that I've been talking about. And an example is that the first time that all of these different spiritual communities came together and formed an umbrella organization called the Crestone Spiritual Alliance was specifically in response to an environmental threat. Natural gas wells that had been approved on a national refuge, the most protected category of land in the United States. And all of these religious organizations came together, mobilized some aspects of earth jurisprudence law with many other partners, and forestalled that drilling that would have been very close to many of these spiritual centers, much of whose economy is based on retreats and refuge in nature. So there are successes and more to come. I will also say, though, that rather than simply celebrate a place like Crestone as exceptionalist, we can also see it as a model of a place that is distinctly challenged. Simply the location, high altitude, very arid climate, very short growing season, but then also the community aspects. There are long standing conflicts and impasses between different factions of the community. The one I'll mention here is especially along generational and class lines, so younger, poorer residents and older residents that own property. Many of the older residents see youth as extremely alienated, disaffected, against work because they see that it only benefits the wealthy, and anarchistic. And they really fear that this youthful generation are awaiting societal collapse so that there can be mass appropriations of property. This kind of alienation and polarization in the community is very toxic and problematic. It comes along with strong anti-government, anti-regulation, anti-corporate, sometimes grouping all of those things as exactly the same thing. And these are the kinds of things that really have to be attended to on a community level through dialogue and healing efforts. Some declare this resiliency initiative that I described completely fractured and defunct, while others are cheering on. Look at the progress that the food team and the water team and the energy team are making. And so even the questions of whether it's moving forward are open questions. In other words, this place isn't simply a charmed place that is outside of the issues that many communities face. It's very much within them. Okay, so what are some of the global indications that a locality like this can use? One of them, Myra spoke about, the rights of nature movement coming out of many places and shepherded by the United Nations Harmony with Nature. We're bringing a session in May about that. Another is dialogue, especially we know that, and many of you, I think, have been part of, Talanoa dialogues taken from the Fijian practice and utilized at the COP meetings, the Convention of Partner meetings in Bonn, Germany last November to great effect. This is a storytelling method based on building empathy and moving things forward collectively. And it was so successful at shifting the typical kinds of conversations that now many groups at different levels of organization, from localities all the way up to global conferences, are using Talanoa dialogue processes. And a third is out of the Inconvenient Truth and Inconvenient sequel films about climate change that Al Gore was part of. There's an inconvenient Sabbath of gathering some of the understandings of different spiritual traditions. And what are their language? What do you need to know about one another to keep people at the table? And my students are going to be involved in helping the Creston spiritual communities contribute to this inventory. So these are but ways that we can be looping the local into the global, so that if a small community has breakthroughs in this evolutionary sense, that they can actually be shared and in alliance with other communities, creating different kinds of cross-cutting tendrils of democracy, and again, training both nation states but also international organization. We can choose to foment this democracy, see it as a cultural question that has to be fed through institutions and through people, but we really have to start by attending to individual wellness and social ecologies in community again. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing about more of all of your work and conversations to come.
Okay, very good. We even have 1 minute for questions. So if you have a question, spit it out. No questions? No questions. So it's your turn. Thank you very much.
It's a record, but
Yes, so you switched.
sure.
So now it's time for Fabio Marcelli, Research Director, Institute for International Legal Studies, National Research Council, Italy, who will speak about participatory democracy, myth or reality?
So good morning, everybody. I am very happy to be here, and I wish to thank the organizers of this beautiful conference, in particular my friend Susanna Caffaro, for having invited me to give a brief speech here in Lecce, very beautiful town, among other things. My speech will be devoted to an aspect which is democratic participation, which of course is closely connected with supranational democracy, because democratic participation you can have at different levels, and all these levels are connected among themselves. You have a local level, you have a regional level, you have a national level, you have a global level. But of course, all these levels alimент each other. You cannot imagine to have a global democracy without having a working local or national democracy. Before going on, I was delighted to hear from Myra that the reference she made to the initiative of the Plurinational Republic of Bolivia for the resolution on the rights of the heart inside the United Nations, because among other things I had a chance to organize in Italy the local conference in cooperation with the embassy of the Plurinational Republic of Bolivia. We had 3 sessions, 2 of them took place in FAO, and the third one, the final one, took place in my Institute of International Legal Studies of the National Research Council in Rome, and there we also approved the final resolution, which unfortunately I didn't bring with me because I didn't know that Mara would have mentioned that issue, but I can send it to her and to others after this resolution to see that, of course, also environment and democracy are very closely linked subjects, and participatory democracy. Maybe participatory is useless to say participatory because you cannot have a democracy which is not participatory. A democracy which is not participatory is a fake democracy, and fortunately we have now in the earth a lot of fake democracies and very few participatory democracies. Anyhow, the scheme of my intervention is rather simple. I will make reference as a lawyer or a person which intends to be a lawyer, we made some studies in law, a reference to the legal sources, to international legal sources of democratic participation, and then some references also to the reality of facts, which unfortunately is rather different from the legal sources. So going on, the normative basis of the participatory democracy is contained in two very important international legal documents, which are the United Nations, the Universal Declaration, on Human Rights of 48, Article 21, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, Article 25. More or less, these two documents have the same content. They say first that everyone has to take part. The declaration says to the government of his country. The covenant says the conduct of public affairs in this sense is more open also to a global democracy, because public affairs, of course, are also and even more affairs which are decided and discussed and debated at global level, directly or through freely chosen representative, and to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret ballot, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the electors. This is more or less the wording of both the covenant and the declaration. As you know, probably know, the covenant is said to have a more binding character as an international treaty, while the declaration is more sort of soft law and less binding, but more or less they have the same content. The declaration also says the access to public service, but in this framework it can be judged rather secondary. So we have also other documents. I cannot dwell on them because of time problems, of course, but I will short mention the two Human Rights Commission resolution of 2005, which are very important in my mind, the 32 and 29, which are to some extent complementary, because the 29, which was approved at majority, not by all states, indicates which are the preconditions for democracy, which are strengthening of popular participation, equity, social justice, non-discrimination as essential foundation of democracy. So a discourse which attempts to be more comprehensive and more in-depth, while the other resolution, which was adopted by consent unanimously by that commission, is about the connection between democracy and the rule of law. We have also a guidance note of the Secretary General of Democracy, which is of 4 years later, 2009, and we have a series of resolutions of the Human Rights Council on different aspects, rule of law, equal political participation, particular aspects such as disabilities, racism, promotion of democratic and equitable international order, and the right to equitable participation of all. Of course, we cannot analyze all these resolutions, but only to say that, to mention that there is now a rather developed corpus of resolutions and of mainly soft law and United Nations basis on participatory democracy. Some comments. The first one, there is no option for representative democracy with competing lists. The so-called Western model is not accepted as such at universal level. I wish to mention in this context a very important point made by the International Court of Justice in 1986 in the Nicaragua case on international self-determination, point 163. The court said adherence by a state to any particular doctrine does not constitute a violation of customary international law. To hold otherwise would make nonsense of the fundamental principle of state sovereignty on which the rule of international law rests, and the freedom of choice of the political, social, economic, and cultural system of a state, something we should always keep in mind when we speak about democracy. The reality is rather bleak and sad, because we face a crisis of democracy. Here I try to highlight some major factors of this crisis. First one, the hijacking of democratic institutions by private powers. Second, the deferment of decision to international, for instance, the treaty on trade and investment, also called TTIP, or regional, for instance, in European Union level with democracy deficit. So paradoxically, this existence of other decision levels is a reason of weakening of democracy, not of strengthening democracy. This is something we live rather commonly in Europe, because the European order is still an order with an evident deficit of democracy for a series of reasons. I don't have now the time to analyze more in depth. And the third factor is the so-called market instead of democracy. They say that the mechanism of governing the society are entrusted to the so-called market, which is the play, more or less free play of economic forces without the intervention of political powers and of policies. One example of that interference is the famous or notorious letter of JP Morgan of 28 May 2013 about the euro-hour adjustment, about halfway there. This is the title of this letter, of this stance they took 5 years ago. And they said that this very powerful financial firm, which is JP Morgan, took a very specific and characterized position on the systems of the periphery of Europe, of Southern Europe, saying constitutions tend to show a strong socialist influence, reflecting the political strength the left-wing parties gained after the defeat of fascism. And so they show some features which, following JP Morgan, are negative ones, like weak executive, weak central states, the right of protest, if welcome changes are made to political status quo. So it's an example of how economic powers and financial powers go strong, intervene strongly in politics with negative consequences for democracy. The consequences of that, I would like to connect myself to the first intervention we listened today, are the state for democratic legitimation to establishing nation based on identitary factors, so-called populism and political apathy. I read 2 days ago very interesting thought of Noam Chomsky on this aspect of political apathy, why there is a political apathy in the United States, for instance, or in Britain, which are the main Western countries which led, among other things, to Brexit and to the election of Donald Trump. Other examples of contradiction between myth and reality, I will be very quick because I see that time is running, is the Greek bailout referendum of 5th of July 2015. Notwithstanding 61% of the electorate voted no to the acceptation of the agreement plan submitted by the so-called Troika, a substantially similar plan was accepted and implemented by the government, so which is the democracy. The other example, which is little less negative, is the Italian referendum on water in 12 and 13 June 2011. Around 95% of Italian electorate rejected the possibility to privatize water, notwithstanding that the government after implemented the privatization problem, but this privatization problem was countered by judicial decision of Constitutional Court and of Administrative Court at national and regional level, and by policies implemented at local level, not everywhere, but in significant towns, like, for instance, Naples and lastly also Turin and others. Another examples of denial of democracy are the mega projects which are without democracy, like the so-called TAV, the high-velocity train in northern Italy, but we have also other examples, and one which is rather close to here is called TAP, which is a project to build a very big gas duct here in this region. Here we have a very important source, which is the decision of the Permanent People Tribunal on these matters. I have made a quotation of this decision, which was adopted a couple of years ago. very notable similarities, says the Tribunal, emerged in the method used with reference to such projects regarding the authoritarian and centralized character of the decision related to them, the exclusion of the local population and the administration from decision-making, the inadequacy and sometimes clear inconsistency of the data provided in support of the project, the transformation of political issues inherent to the projects into issues of public order that are assigned to the police and the judiciary, and the rather heavy police and judicial intervention that are interpreted by many as direct methods to discourage and or block emerging opposition and protests. This applies not only to TAP, but also to many other projects in Italy and in Europe and elsewhere in the world. The third negative tendency is there to discredit democratic election. I make here two examples. The first one is the referendum in Catalonia. I want to discuss now the legal value of that referendum from the internal Spanish or the international point of view. But just to highlight the fact that the referendum on independence in Catalonia was treated like a criminal or terroristic act. The people who went to vote and composed the election bureau were brutally treated by police with I don't find the word in English, but they were practically beaten by police. And the promoters were and are still now in prison, like or in exile, like the Puigdemont, the president of Catalonia. The other example, negative example, is that of Venezuela, where there is a democratic election. Maybe Venezuela is the country where more frequently elections happened in the last 20 years. It was about, I think, 25 electoral elections took place at different levels. I had the chance to be there on several occasions as an international observer. But now there is an international attempt to discredit those elections. The next elections will take place on the 20th of May, more or less 1 month from now, and will be a presidential election, but there is United States government, also European government says these are not legitimate elections because probably the political party which is likely to win is opposed to dominant circles in US and European Union. Conclusions, and I finish. International law in matters like democracy and democratic participation is of a rather programmatic character. Its indications may be implemented with the contribution of social and political movements. This is also the importance of the soft law character of this norm, the mainly soft law character of the norm, that can be implemented with the contribution of social and political movements, also by local authorities. But the denial of democracy made by means of external intervention amounts to a grave breach of international law. Lastly, just a little bit of publicity to my, with the permission of our president.
Well, you are out of your time.
Yes,
but make your publicity.
I can make a publicity is out of the time. Like always, the publicity is out of the time. This is the last book I wrote with the contribution of several Italian and also Chinese scholars, which is entitled to Participatory Democracy and Social Rights in a Multipolar World. So, among other things, we discuss also the issue of participatory democracy, which is rather important for two countries like Italy and China, where participatory democracy is not particularly implemented by governments, especially at national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And lasciamo posto a lui. And now we have a planned intervention. Stefano Grasso, who studies plant and animal biotechnology at the University of Udine, Italy. He will speak about educated democracy, creating the tools for an aware democratic system.
So as mentioned, I'm not really from the field, and I really wanted to bring a different point of view from a more scientific environment, let's say, and how as a scientist, we see all the public and political debate, especially over innovation and disruptive technologies. As Professor Caffaro mentioned this morning, there is a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges coming from the new technologies and from the new discoveries. Of course, they are also growing at a really fast pace, and this makes them even more complicated to understand. But in the meanwhile, the new technology are adopted and used by people, and this complicates also the society in which we live. All of these, of course, mean that in order to correctly use and fully exploit the new technologies, we have to be able to understand them. And I, as a scientist especially, have the feeling that often there is a lot of lack of understanding, and we tend to polarize in confront of the new technologies, being in a sentiment of denial, of complete rebuttal, or a complete hype. And we can think about these from social media to blockchain technologies to biotechnologies, which is my field, and so on. And of course, this is not the right process, because when we lack the understanding and the knowledge of the technology, we are not able to fully decide, and we are not able to freely decide, which would be basically meaning that we live in a more formal type of democracy. So we are only able to decide among what other people tell us we can choose. And of course, the fact would be that the whole population should be able to understand and to be aware of the possibilities and the threats from new technologies. But this is a very long and slow process, as we all know, since, let's say, we tried to educate the whole population. So, as a temporary solution, for sure, one option is to educate the representatives, so the people who take the decision, in order to at least let them take aware decision that would stop the vicious circle and start a more virtuous circle. We have a lot of historical example where decision makers were really educated, and this made the strength and the power of the country. But those were, of course, not democratic system. If we want to look at nowadays example, we can think of companies. Companies also hire very skilled and educated people in order to take decisions. But at the same point, in the public, so the policymakers are not always at the same level of companies. So we are kind of competing in an unfair way. We are competing against going on two different tracks. And so we need educated policymakers. But of course, we cannot forget that we cannot reduce the democratic level. So we cannot choose only among educated people, which will, of course, impair the classical principle that everybody can be elected and everybody should be fully represented, from least educated people to also very educated people. But still, we have this necessity of informed and aware decision. And this brings to the necessity to educate the representative after the election. So after the election, we could think of obligate policymakers to take courses on relevant and novel topics. So, of course, on the, let's say, problems of the moment. Of course, these courses could be targeted depending whether it's a representative at the level of the city council, or it's a representative at the level of regional council or a national council. Of course, we could also implement system of verification based only on attendance rather than based on examination. And we could even think to make this verification a compulsory requirement to continue the mandate. I mean, it may seem very drastic solution, but if we think about it, 50 years ago, if a politician was condemned, he would not abandon his office, while nowadays we have laws that stop or oblige the politician to resign in case condemn. So we can really think that this may also, how do you say, broaden the horizon of the view of the policymaker, because we could even ask them to collaborate and to cooperate at international level. We can send people from city council to discuss with people from another city in another country which had a similar problem and implemented a specific solution, and those people could go and learn how that solution worked, what are the consequences, what are the pros and the cons, and then come back with a more aware decision process. So, of course, this suggestion that I bring has still a lot of challenges. You can think that the person who decided the topic of these courses may bias then the decision-making process, as well as the person who holds lectures. But of course, we can still think of implementing ways that will reduce this bias as much as possible. As well as we are not sure, I mean, this is a proposal, but what will be exactly the effectiveness of such courses. And of course, I'm sure that everybody can think of a lot of other problems, but a lot of proposal came with maybe challenges to solve, and then challenges were slowly solved. Thanks for the attention.
Wow, bravo. Right in time, 3 seconds less. And 5 minutes of break, and we will start immediately after.